A lot of times when I'm looking for something specific to buy or to eat or experience, I'll get on Google and search for it. And a keyword that I use when I search is the word best. Let's say I'm vacationing in Tucson, Arizona, and I have this craving for Mexican food. So I do a Google search for it. I search for best Mexican food Tucson. And when I do, I receive a list of some recommended places. And the highest one on the list is a place called Mako Restaurant. It has 399 reviews with a rating of 4.6 out of 5. That's pretty good. And when I check out some of the reviewers' comments, I read such things as one of the best food places in town, and large selection and super friendly service. And this place is such a hidden gem. That all sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty promising. It kind of makes me want to just leave right now and drive to Tucson just to try this place out. Now I could have done a Google search for a Mexican restaurant and found one with a 2.3 out of 5 rating with a lot of negative comments. And I could have chosen to go to that below average place instead. But why would I want to do that? Why would I want to settle for a bad meal when I can have a really good meal? In life, we don't set our goals on experiencing or obtaining things that are bad or mediocre or below average. We're looking for those things that are truly good. And in the spiritual realm, God is truly good. He is certainly not below average or mediocre or bad. Instead, he is a God who is so good that we can't even truly comprehend the depth of his goodness. In a childhood prayer that we recite, we say the words, God is great, God is good. Let us thank him for our food. And that prayer addresses two of the primary attributes of God. First is greatness, that God is great, he's omnipotent. And we who believe in God know that he is the God of all creation, that he set the entire world in motion, that he is all powerful and nothing is too big for him. He is great. But the prayer also says that he is good. And we really can't comprehend the fullness of God's greatness. It's beyond understanding, but the same is true of his goodness. He is so good that we can't grasp how good he really is. He is truly the best. If we truly believe that God is the best that life has to offer, we really aren't tempted to look elsewhere to have our needs met because he is all we need. James 1:17 says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." So James presents three facts about the goodness of God. And first, James says that God is good. God gives only good gifts. It says every good and perfect gift is from above. Everything good in the world comes from God. If it did not come from God, it's not good. Matthew 7:9-11, Jesus said, "Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" I used to joke with my children about what was for dinner. That's always one of the big questions of life for a 10-year-old. What's for dinner? So sometimes I'd be joking with them, and I'd answer, "Tonight, we're having rock soup." Well, they never took me seriously because rock soup would be a horrible meal. Humans can't eat rocks. When I considered dinner for the boys, I would try to provide them with something that was good and good for them. I didn't plan my meals thinking, what should we have for dinner tonight? I know. The boys hate liver and onions, and I'll serve them that. Why would I purposely give them something they hated just because I could? Instead, The boys generally looked forward to the meal times because they liked what was served and it was good. So just as my kids could trust me to give them what was good, not only good tasting, but also good for them, certainly we can trust that God will give us what is good. But there's a wrinkle in all this. Sometimes I would give something to my boys that they didn't really want, but it was good for them. A good example is medicine. If one of my kids got sick, I'd insist that they take their medicine to get better. And no kid likes to take a pill, and usually that liquid stuff that they have to take, that tastes pretty bad too. So they really would rather not put this stuff in their mouths. But even though it appeared bad to them, it was actually good for them. And so sometimes things that we consider bad are actually proven to be for our good. The Apostle Paul had what he called a thorn in the flesh. It was some kind of a physical ailment that he suffered with. And when Paul wrote the church at Corinth about it, he said that he had been given this ailment. And Paul came to realize that this thorn in the flesh was given to him by God. It seems like a really strange thing for God to do. What would a good, loving God, what would he be doing inflicting Paul with a physical ailment or disability that would torment him the rest of his life? Paul didn't want it, certainly didn't ask for it. He saw no purpose in it, and so he prayed for God to remove it. But God didn't remove it. And in time, Paul recognized that this thorn in the flesh was a blessing, not a curse. He realized that although it brought him discomfort, it also served a purpose. He said that it kept him from becoming conceited and also helped him to depend on God's power instead of his own power. And so he said, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." So sometimes the things we perceive as bad may actually be good for us, or at least lead to a good purpose. And so if we find ourselves with our own thorn in the flesh, what should we do about it? Well, I think we should do what Paul did about it. Pray. Pray about it. He prayed that God would remove it, and that's a reasonable thing to pray. But the answer that Paul received was basically, no. I gave you that problem for your own good. God's answer to Paul's prayer was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness." As we said, that wasn't really the answer that Paul was looking for, but he accepted it anyway. Paul realized the purpose behind the problem. And although it was annoying, it actually drew him closer to God and helped him depend on God's strength. His thorn in the flesh was actually a good thing given by a good God. Now, that's not to say that the bad in the world comes from God. And we live in a day in which most people, instead of thanking God for his goodness, they blame God for all that's bad in the world. When you take out an insurance policy for your house, it probably has some exceptions to some occurrences it calls acts of God. And what do the insurance companies mean when they talk about acts of God? Scary things like tornadoes, cyclones, earthquakes, and hurricanes. Well, that's a pretty negative view of God, isn't it? It views God as a powerful God of destruction and chaos. It's true that we live in a fallen world in which bad things happen to good people. But don't blame God for the fall. Don't believe that God is looking for just the right opportunity to strike you with lightning or destroy your house. God is the giver of good gifts. Not only does God give good gifts, he is constantly giving. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights. In the Greek language, the phrase coming down is a present participle, which means it keeps on coming down. And so this speaks of God's faithfulness. In this world, oftentimes we're presented with limited time offers. I was on the Dodgers website browsing for baseball caps, and there was a banner on the top that said 30% off all orders. That's pretty cool. But in the corner, there was also a warning. Hurry! Ends in 7 hours, 6 minutes, and 37 seconds. And the clock in the corner kept ticking down the seconds when this offer would expire. It was there to remind me that their good offer would not last. Their goodness would expire. They would soon take the deal away. If I wanted to get a deal at a baseball cap, I had to act now. Well, God doesn't roll like that. His offer of goodness does not expire. There are no loopholes or strings attached. God will be good to you no matter when. He's consistently good. That's another way of saying that he is faithful. There aren't special seasons for his goodness like Christmas or Easter or your birthday. He's always good, consistently proving his goodness by the good gifts he gives. And the reason for this is that God's nature doesn't change. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. And those heavenly lights that James refers to are the lights in the sky, the sun, moon, and stars. And as you look into the sky, those lights appear to be changing positions all the time. And our main light, the sun, causes shadows on earth that are always shifting around. When Judy and I walk early in the morning, the sun from the east creates these long shadows toward the west. But if we go out the same day in the evening, as the sun is setting in the west, our shadows are cast completely in the opposite direction. And so James points out a contrast between the Creator and his creation. God is unchanging, although the universe is constantly changing. The stars move around and our shadows shift around, but God remains constant. God does not change. He cannot change for the worse because he is holy. And he cannot change for the better because he's already perfect. Now, people are different. People have a tendency to change, and not always for the better. And we could certainly put Judas Iscariot into the category of someone who changed drastically. He was so trusted as a member of Christ's disciples that he managed their money. He was the treasurer. But this trusted friend of theirs ended up betraying their Lord, leading to his death. His apparent change of character must have completely shocked the other disciples. And people can shock us by the change in their lives. People who seem so good can just drastically change for the bad. But we'll never be shocked at God's changing character because he does not and will not change. God is good, and he continues to be good. So there's an application in this verse for us today. It's that when we are tempted to sin, we should remember God's goodness. Because when we sin, we're accepting a lie about God, a lie that God really isn't as good as promised. It's the attitude that, yes, God has given me some good gifts, but I can do better. There are things I want that God isn't letting me have. He's holding out on me. And that was the basis of the very first sin. Satan told Eve that God was holding out on her and Adam, that even if he had given them some good things, there were some things he wasn't giving them. And Satan convinced Eve that this fruit that God told them to stay away from was actually beneficial to them. It would make them wise like God. And so Eve came to believe three things about the fruit. First, it was good for food. Second, it looked good, but also it would make her wise like God. And so in Eve's mind, God wasn't as good as he could be. The fruit was obviously incredible. Satan said so. And God wasn't letting her have the good fruit. So She just took matters into her own hands and took the fruit for herself, even though God told her not to. If we truly believe God is good, we believe that his word to us is good. And so if he instructs us on how to live, what to do and what not to do, it's for our own good. Eve saw the fruit to be incredibly good, but God knew better. When we take our eyes off of God's goodness, we replace his goodness with a false substitute. Last week, we looked at David's sin with Bathsheba to make the point that if David would have just known the full consequences of his sin, he probably wouldn't have done it. But there's something else we can say about David's sin based upon today's verse. That if David would have remembered God's goodness in his life, he probably wouldn't have sinned with Bathsheba. When the prophet Nathan confronted David in his sin, Nathan said to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" So Nathan says to David, look how good God has been to you. All that he's given you. And yet you repay him with doing evil? God had been very good to David. But David took his eyes off of God's blessings. He forgot God's goodness. And when he did, he sinned. Now, on the other hand, it was God's goodness that kept Joseph from sinning when he was tempted by his master's wife. When Joseph was tempted with pretty much the same sin that David fell for, he said, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph knew that all these blessings had come from God. It was the goodness of God through the hands of his employer that kept him from falling into sin. In our lives, there must be a balance of both fear of God and love for God. And the first line of prevention against temptation is a negative one, the judgment of God. Because we realize that sin has consequences. And fear of punishment does serve as a deterrent to sin. Probably one of the reasons that so many people are so embroiled in sin today is that they don't take God's justice seriously. They even say things like, "I don't believe that a good God would send people to hell." So in their minds, God's goodness equates to an extremely permissive parent who has no standards of behavior for his children and no consequences when they misbehave. But that's simply not reality. Our God is a God of love, but he's also a God of justice. And his word makes it clear that the wicked will not go unpunished. The second line of prevention against temptation is positive, and that is the goodness of God. The fear of God must be balanced with our love for God. We might obey him because sin has negative consequences and God will discipline us. But how much better it is to obey God because he's already been so good and generous to us and we love him for it. God's gifts are always better than Satan's bargains. There are no free gifts with Satan. We always end up paying dearly for the so-called gifts from Satan. Adam and Eve found that out, and so did David. But when God gives to us, there are no hidden hooks. It's not like the salmon eggs on the fishing hook, hiding the hook from the fish. There is no catch, no loophole, no hook to the goodness of God. He doesn't bait us with a good gift in order to trick us or manipulate us. God simply gives good gifts because He is a good God. God is always and forever good.